bit of a heavy session, yeah. We've heard about the risks of radiation, Katie, orthopedic risks of trying to protect ourselves from said radiation by Bob. It's a bit difficult, right? This job that we love, we help people, and yet we're harmed by it. But, as Bob mentioned, there are some new solutions on the horizon. But first, why am I up here? I have the pleasure of knowing many of you through a lot of our education and research efforts towards CTO-PCI, complex PCI, imaging, calcium modification, all these things. Do you mind rubbing it up? Why I'm up here on the radiation session? Well, I've recently done this thing called transitioning into mid-career, which is super fun. So you're not young, you're not old, but you're somewhere in the middle. It's kind of nice. You kind of know what you're doing a bit more. You got some wisdom, not as much some days, but not quite all the way there. You also, unfortunately, have had colleagues long enough that things start to happen. So I have a few friends even in this room started to have some issues. Radiation-related issues, some back pain, but again, before I was young career, early career, whatever we call it, relatively invincible. Could really do just about anything, didn't matter much. Come mid-career, you start to have people that matter to you, really have problems. And in fact, my mentor who gave me my first job, who got my family out of debt, called me up, paralyzed. What are you going to do with that? Well, what you may do is think, well, I can still do the CTOs, I can still talk about the calcium, but what if we also took a bent to do some research, do some studies, and try to help ourselves and our colleagues do our job a bit better. And so that's kind of how I got involved in all of this. So a little while back, this survey came out that said, oh, for goodness sakes, 60% of people have major back issues. People retire early because of all of this. People have cancer. Ugh. So I get the call. I do a bit of work with Sky, and I get the call, hey, we need you to get something sorted out, come up with some sort of just idea for a solution. So we talk to a lot of smart friends, which that's one thing I have the luxury of, is lots of smart friends, which means I don't have to do too much, really just distill what all my smart friends say. And so we realized that there was 4 pillars to this idea of getting enhanced radiation protection. The first and foremost, and I can tell you, unfortunately mid-career and things like that also make you more in charge of things. I'm not quite sure it's supposed to be that way, but once you become cath lab director, service line director, you start leading groups of individuals, you realize that they're your responsibility. And in fact, young me didn't know that they were my responsibility, but older me certainly does. And in fact, it's not just my colleagues that I have to go say, hey, you did a dumb thing, don't do that again. Whether it be behavior, most of the time, or technique related, it's how are my nurses? How are my techs? And in fact, their well-being becomes more of what I spend my day-to-day in that service line director position, actually, than my colleagues themselves. And so if we are going to do something, whether it's with a new radiation protection device, it has to involve everyone, right? It can't just be the physician, right? It can't just be the physician and the tech, right? They're always the ones all chummy, sitting there talking, and the nurses over there like, hey, or the radiographer. It's got to involve everyone, right? Because everyone is involved in this. Everyone gets radiation, everyone gets orthopedic issues. So the entire team has to be protected. We can't have people cowering behind shields and all this while the rest of us get to jump around with no lead. It has to involve the entire team. The next is it has to be seamless. And that's one thing as you go along, you realize that things that impede workflow don't get used. We can all think of different devices. If you've been in the game long enough, they're really exciting up front, and then they're a bit of a pain to use, and where do they end up? Hallway, back of the lab. Sometimes your administrator comes down and is like, hey, we spent $100,000 on that. What's that? And you're like, don't worry about it. It doesn't work anymore. So what we can't do is have something like that, right? It has to be seamlessly integrated into the workflow. The reason for that is you got to get cases done, and sometimes people come in really sick. If it takes too long to set up, what are you doing? You're not going to use it, right? The third thing is it has to have procedural versatility. And this is, again, something as you go along, you realize that there's very few cath labs in our world that are simply there for coronaries, right? You just go in, I just do coronaries here, that's it. Now, at some large labs, that may be the case, but the reality is in most of the working world, you got a lab that does coronaries. Sometimes you got to do some structural in there. You might actually have some vascular surgeon doing endo work in there. In fact, you may have EP colleagues who want to come implant a device that really ticks you off because sometimes it takes a long time and you're trying to get your studies done. Whatever you use has to be versatile. It has to work in all those different situations, because anytime you say, oh, well, it doesn't work in this case, so we'll just put it off to the side, that happens repetitively. Again, this device becomes defunct and it's not used. And one thing you realize, especially when we're talking about not small amounts of money, is that it has to work with every physician, every team, every time. And that is how you make a difference. It has to be something that you don't even realize is in the room that you're working with. And then finally, and this is the base, this is the bedrock, this is what everything is built on, there has to be robust data, right? It can't just be, well, I did this thing, I had some numbers, it looked really good, great. It's got to have data in all these scenarios, protecting everyone and all these different types of procedures. So, to sort of sum up all this, we cannot eliminate radiation yet. There are some companies working on fluoroless solutions. Let's be honest, that may be a bit down the road, but there is hope for the future. Who's to say? But right now, it's a problem, and we can't eliminate it, but we can take positive steps. And what's the first thing we always talk about when we talk about finding solutions to things? Is that we educate, right? We educate ourselves, right? We understand what the radiation is, what the doses are, what's actually happening. How many people taking a live dosimeter in a case right now would have any idea what kind of radiation you get? What you might know is the air karma or the DAP or something like that. Probably not. But you have no idea what you're getting. And if you do know, you might know what you're getting over lead. You know what you're getting under lead. That's what your body cares about. So educate yourself on what's going on in your lab. What kind of settings do I have? What kind of machine do I have? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my staff? Educate yourself on what's actually going on, because there are real consequences, as you guys have seen. The next is we have to talk about it. We've got to take it from just a test that I had to pass in order to be able to get into the cath lab. Please, someone give me the cheat sheet so that I can write these answers down so I can move on and get my license and moving on with my life, to actually being at conferences where we talk about it. We talk about the difficulty of it. We talk about the difficulty of not being able to see it, but knowing that it's a real thing. The education that follows from that is the key to finding the solution. And then we have to demand it. We have to stop being at the behest of what's too expensive, and we simply, I talked to my administrator, they went, listen, this is ALARA. This is what we demand. This is what if we're gonna put ourselves out there for others, we have to have the same kind of standards for ourselves. You simply cannot take care of people if you're being injured over time. There's no reason society or the system should put in 10, 15 years in training a physician who then 10 to 15 years down the road is then crippled by the very thing that the system asks them to do. That is simply irrehensible. Is that the right word? Anyway, it's not a good thing. I've been working on some cool English stuff. Anyway, so it's, what am I, a nubbin? Noggin? I forget what I learned yesterday. Anyway, it's not okay, right? We have to stand for that. We have to stand for that together. We've lost the idea of what it means to stand as a physician community over the years. 20, 30, 40 years ago, people knew what that meant. We have to figure that out again. The question is, are we going to make it? Oh, I stole the thunder. Oh. The question is, are we going to make it visible? Thank you.
Great. Brilliant. That was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for that. So, let's have a look around the room. What questions do you have for us about radiation? Any burning questions? Thank you. Can we get a mic over here?
It's not ready, Alan.
Okay, shout it out, it's coming.
What would you recommend in terms of radiation protection and how to get it into our labs? Because this question's been brought up.
I've brought it up in our labs, and the response that we get is yes, but the risk to the patient will be higher if you use these pads or if you use these other things. And that's a fair, point, but how do we mitigate that in terms of protecting ourselves but not also increasing our patients' risk as well?
Okay. I've got the brains here, so I'm going to put that one out to them.
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer that. So, if you look at the data on does this increase the risk to patient, one thing that is the understanding about radiation is the way that it works whenever the radiation hits the body and scatters to the room. So we're dealing with scatter radiation, not direct radiation. Most of the time we're not actually in the field, where we're getting or underneath the table. So it's that scatter radiation. So when it scatters to you, what slows it down, what stops it, is the heavy metal that's in the lead or the bismuth or whatever heavy metal you're using for your barrier. It doesn't bounce. That's one of the things that a lot of people think, that if it does bounce away, like if it bounces to the ceiling and bounces all the way back to you, then that's really a negligible number. Okay, so there's very little bounce. What actually comes to the patient and hits the patient and then scatters out is really what the patient's going to get. It's not really hitting, then bouncing back to the patient. So the amount that the patient gets is really, really minimal. What you have to be careful of is keeping these shields out from underneath your camera, because these cameras already know that, oh, there's a problem, I need to try to penetrate that, and so it ramps it up. That's where the patient gets more dose. So you want to be sure that whatever radiation protection shielding that you're using, you keep that out from underneath the camera, because that's just intuitive to the camera and all of its software that it's going to rev up the KV. So that's the main thing. So as long as you keep it out from underneath the direct flow, it's not going to increase the risk to the patient at all. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had this issue come up actually at Mount Sinai, and it was sort of brought up by the radiation physicist there, and it was like, it's actually a pretty good question. So what we did in a series of 10 patients was just threw monitors all over the patient. The problematic one was the ones we decided to put under the patient. I felt slightly bad about that, but they were there. And so right on the butt, which felt, you just have to find the areas where the monitors aren't going to be too uncomfortable. And what we saw was that there was no statistical significantly difference between any of that. So I do think that is something that theoretically makes some real sense. Like, you got to make sure of that, right? What we don't want to do is put anybody at harm. That is obviously the opposite. But what we also have to do is get away from the theoretical, because again, this is a field that is absolutely developing. Bob and and a lot of folks have been on this for years, and it's really been this developing thing that is really now starting to ramp up. And these are the questions that have to get asked. But we also can't just hang our hat on just finding the one thing that, then I'm not going to do it. You have to actually answer the question and then say, well, if that's not the case, then what else am I using as an excuse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. In my hospital, it's mostly about the cost. We had a question over here first, and then we're going to take one more over here.
I would just like to thank you for the beautiful talks and very important topics. I think it's not so popular, but it's equally important. So regarding the question, we also published some papers. We use ultra-low dose protocols. So we trained our eyes to 3.75 frames per second. So I do personally every CTO with very, very low dose, lowering the detector, elevating your table, strong panning, and fluorostore and all about that. And so we published the paper when we have maybe less than 10% of all CTO procedures above 1 gray. And also regarding the protection of ourselves, I would make advice for the community. So I use zero gravity, all the shieldings, and zero gravity for every procedure. And in the next cath lab, I ordered zero gravity. So I went to my administrator, like a director of the cath lab, want to protect everybody. I told them, this is 100,000 euros, and another one, and in another hospital where I work, we have 2 ramparts. So I told them, this is expensive. How much is my all education expensive? How much my disc are worth, or how much my bone marrow is worth? So when you talk about this, I will work here or I will not work here. So that we made very aggressive. So my bone marrow, my spine is, I don't know, $5 billion. I don't know.
I'd love to see the math on that.
No, but that's our proposition. So we're very fanatical about this, and we have to be healthy for long.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that comment. We are valuable commodities. A lot has been invested into us, and we have to make sure we protect that investment for the people who've made it. Quickly, then Ingi, and then Hint. Have you got
just one thing we need to think about is what is acceptable radiation, because the limits we have now, it's all in millisieverts. That's a lot. And in our last tender, we were looking for equipment to give us better dosage, in particular if you want to take off your LADs. So we need better monitors with microsieverts.
Yeah.
And this is something that we need to get to the industry.
Yeah.
And we need to define.
Because the guidance is that the dose should be as low as possible. Not here, but just as low as you can get it.
Right.
So if we have technology now that can get it lower, we should be adopting that, because that's what the law says.
What about continuous monitoring, just to make the point, to make it visible? We make ourselves more aware of our continuous dose.
Yeah.
You know, and that hopefully will, because it's not just about the shading, it's about your behavior, it's about your frame rates, it's about your angulation. You know, shielding is only one component of an overall strategy.
Yeah.
But think about when we make these big leaps with STEMI care, if we found something that decreased STEMI mortality by 0.5%, you would do it, right? Like that would be a big deal. You would go to your hospital and be like, oh yeah, a few more people might die if we don't do it, you know? And yet we have something that can dramatically, leaps and bounds, 90-some odd percent reduce a known harmful carcinogen. What's the if that was a therapeutic for a patient, that would be, what is better than a late-breaking trial, whatever the next thing is? That would be like a monster thing. And yet, here we are.
I know we want to come over here as well, but if I could just add on to that, I think one of the problems that we probably face, and we're hearing from all the comments, is kind of the interface between what we think we need and the support that we get from our institutions and the higher ups. So essentially, we're talking about how do we convince other people that this is really important, that we are really important, and we're spending what is actually a fraction of their expenditure on. Yeah. And if we had I'm sure someone's done a calculation, maybe even sitting next to me here. How much does it cost for an interventional cardiologist to go off for 6 months with a bad back?
Hold that thought. One last question, and then we have to go to our next session because we're out of time. I'm really glad that so many of you are so engaged with this, because you need to own this.
My question about the musculoskeletal injury. How could we minimize that risk? Because in practice, particularly in the stage of training, we do case after case after case without even...
The answer is go and see these guys, find out about leadless solutions, the things that take those off of you. Okay, that's where we need to get to. Can I get you all just to give a big round of applause for some amazing talks here? This is just really moving.